Despite being portrayed as one of the top 3 pirates of this generation alongside Law and Luffy, and even having the highest bounty at the Sab-Odi archipelago, I think we all know that Eustass Kid is often considered to be one of the more disappointing characters at this point in the story. Because even in his victory against Big Mom, many viewed him as playing second fiddle to Law, his backstories have been relegated to SBS's and Viva cards, and of course he got absolutely obliterated by Shanks and fell to the depths of the sea. But I think the question we have to ask is, where does he go from here? Because surely he's not dead yet, because hardly anyone dies in One Piece, and it feels like every devil fruit user that falls in the ocean seems to end up on the beach somewhere anyway. Plus, I doubt that Oda's done writing Kid's story, because we barely know what it is in the first place. Kid's gotten hardly any backstory thus far. All we really know is that his crew started off as gang leaders who pulled off a coup d'etat against other gang leaders, and that he and Killer shared the same first crush named Victoria, who was killed by said gang leaders. And neither of those were even in the manga. We don't even know the true reason that Kid started going after Shanks, despite him targeting Shanks 3 times now if we're counting the Alliance. But I think that whole setup is exactly why Oda brought Kid to Elbaf. Because not only is this shaping up to be the most Shanks focused or Fagarland focused arc thus far, but Shanks is the most common denominator between Kid and Luffy. So if Oda was ever going to develop the relationship between those two, kinda like he did for Law and Luffy, Shanks should probably be at the epicenter of it. Because unlike Law, who has gotten a ton of focus in the post-time skip, Kid has not had nearly as much opportunity. In fact, this is the first time that Kid and Luffy have been on the same island without Law there, literally ever. Unless you count Udon Prison, where Law was in Wano, but not in Udon, but regardless, this is the first opportunity for Kid and Luffy to connect over something other than stupid competitive stuff. And even back in 2017, when Oda talked about creating the supernova, he said that he always envisioned Kid being important, but Law was kind of a surprise. So he always had a plan for this guy, and if Shanks is meant to be a major factor in developing Kid's character, then it makes sense why Oda's had to wait to Elbaf to explain it. And besides, Kid's ship got destroyed, so it's not like he's gonna go anywhere anytime soon. So if Kid's ever gonna get some serious focus in the story, I think it has to be this arc. And I have wanted to do a video on this for so long now, but I couldn't really see where Oda was gonna go with this. At least that was until the recent reveals of Rox D. Xebec and Fagarland Shamrock. I think these two are going to be massive pieces to the Eustass Kid puzzle. So let's start by explaining why that is for Rox. And to start off, did you guys notice that one of Kid's most commonly used creations, being Punk Rotten, has a scar over its eye that matches Rock's scar over the same eye? It's a little weird, isn't it? And so is the fact that their designs are so similar. They have the spiky hair with a big belt, boots, and a furry cape thing. The outfit is actually almost the same as Loki's, I would say. Someone that we already know was inspired by Rox at a very young age. And I think I would even argue that their attitudes are the same. Very crass, loud, and most of all, violent. Because while I can give Rox some credit for not just threatening Harold for whatever his plan is, and even crushing Kaido for suggesting it, he did go and seriously injure Loki twice as a child, and he killed an admiral. And even in the Davy Backfight panel, we see him blow up someone's ship in the donut race, and he's also holding someone's hat with a bloody axe in the other hand, so you can only assume what he did there. And Kid only had the highest bounty at Sab-Odi because of all the damage he would do to ordinary people. We even saw him pull up on Elbaf fully ready to just blow up anyone in his way. Kid even crucified some other pirates. And I know there's plenty of violent pirates out there, don't get me wrong, but when you look at all these different factors in totality, it really feels like there's something brewing between Kid and Rox. And there's actually another really important parallel to consider here, which is the extension of this Loki and Kaido thing. Because I think we can all agree that Loki falling from the tree branch parallels Kaido jumping from Balloon Terminal, right? Where they're both chasing their own death. But what happens if you just go one more step into that parallel and think about the 4 people they fell in front of? Because for Kaido, these were 4 major pirates: Kid, Killer, Hawkins, and Apu. For Loki, these were also 4 major pirates: Rox, Shiki, Stussy, and Whitebeard. Among these groups, I think we can safely say that Kid and Rox were the strongest amongst their peers, and even the way these groups were constructed were kinda similar, as they weren't normal pirates pirate crews. Kid had an alliance that fell apart quickly, and Rox's crew had a ton of infighting since he amassed them using Davy back fights. And if you wanted to parallel the other 3 pirates here, I think Killer and Shiki would be obvious ones because they at least have similar hair, and there's been a theory about Shiki being Killer's dad for a long time now, and with Family Piece being in full swing, I wouldn't be that surprised. And then since Hawkins and Apu were kind of the sellouts of Kid's alliance, maybe that's a hint to something about Stussy and Whitebeard. And I mean, just look at the similarities between these 2 Jolly Rogers. They both have a skull with flaming red hair, and while we don't yet know Rox's true hair color, I feel like red is kinda likely because his flag is black and red, which if that's true, that really sets his whole theory over the edge. But regardless of that, I don't think Kid's gonna be related to Rox because Kid was born 15 years after Rox died, so we know he's not gonna be his son. And I don't think he's gonna be like his grandson either because Family Piece is kinda all over the place. But instead, what I think Oda's doing here is that Rox will be to Kid as Roger was to Luffy, where they both inherited these great pirates' wills without ever meeting them because both of them were born after those great pirates died. It's that bizarre, unexplainable, and serendipitous similarity that we see between a lot of characters that we tend to just call inherited will. Because the thing that makes Luffy very clearly the one that inherited Roger's will isn't that he wants to get the One Piece or that he tells everyone he's going to be the Pirate King, because trust me, there are a lot of people in the One Piece world who want to do those things, but it's because Luffy had the same second dream as Roger. The one that we don't even know about yet, and assuredly Luffy wouldn't have known before he ever said it the first time. That's what brought Yamato to tears and made Shanks excitedly tell people like Rayleigh that Luffy said the same words as Roger, and probably the same reason that Shanks decided to pass the straw hat down to him. So I think Kid's gonna basically be the same thing with Rox, where it's not just that he's gonna want to be king of the world, because that's not exclusive to Rox either, but there might be another secret second dream or just some other odd personality things that make them just like one another. But as we've come to learn, inherited will can come in a lot of forms, and Rox certainly impacted a lot of people, but I think out of all the candidates, Kid actually makes the most sense to fit into the same kind of theme as Roger and Luffy. I think a lot of people might try to say Loki, but Rox is more so his Shanks, right? Because Loki fit in the very same mold as Luffy of being too young to join the crew. And then some might try to say Blackbeard, but that's Rox's son, making Blackbeard kind of more like the ace in this equation. Or maybe some would try to say Buggy, because Oda is definitely building some connection there because the bounty posters are almost identical, but even he might end up being Rox's son, or even if he's not, he was at least born before Rox died, so I think that parallel is still a lot different than Luffy and Roger. So all things considered, I think Kid is at least a very good candidate to fit into this type of mold, but while Luffy never got to meet Roger directly, there was at least a connector between him and Roger, which was Shanks, of course. And Shanks obviously ended up becoming Luffy's biggest inspiration, which is an important difference from the will he inherited, because while he's a lot like Roger, his role model and the person he really wants to surpass is actually Shanks. So I think Kid's gonna need someone like that between him and Rox for a few different reasons. For one, if we assume that Kid actually knows about Rox and heard about his adventures and what he was like, or even maybe saw a picture of him, which would explain the whole thing with Punk Rotten having the same scar as Rox, then there's a pretty good chance that whoever told him would have been pretty close to Rox because he was erased to history. There's not a whole lot of people that know about Rox. Even the Marines that Sengoku was talking to when we first heard about Rox were all shocked about these legends as if they've never heard him before. And even regardless of the whole Rox angle to this whole thing, Kid probably needs an inspiration or mentor type figure somewhere in his life, as most major characters tend to have one. Luffy had Shanks, Law had Corazon, Kobe had Garp, you could say, Ace had Whitebeard, and the list goes on. And a lot of the time, these mentor type characters end up being one of, if not the most important part of these characters' backstories, because they tend to get hurt or even die while protecting the person they inspired. Shanks lost his arm while saving Luffy, Corazon died after getting Law his devil fruit, Garp got stabbed through his body twice and captured while trying to save Kobe, Whitebeard died while trying to save Ace, and so I think that if Oda is kind of hiding the bulk of Kid's backstory from us, as well as the reason he ever targeted Shanks to begin with, I think those two things might be connected. Because what if Shanks just killed Kid's Shanks, and that's why they've had beef all along. I feel like something of this caliber would definitely warrant the hatred for Shanks that Kid has had throughout the story. And when I was doing research for this video, I saw a lot of comments about how Kid only went after Shanks because he thought Shanks was the weakest Yonko, or it was the first one he found, or it was just the other Yonko with red hair, or something like that. And I mean, to be fair, there's not a whole lot of concrete information on this situation, but I think it's pretty clear that there's something deeper going on between the two, because even though Kid has fought other Yonko in the post-time skip, the only one he's ever really wanted to fight was Shanks, because he only got involved in Wano after Kaido got the drop on him and threw him in jail and everything, and even when he went to Whole Cake Island, he was very clear that he was not going after Big Mom directly. This guy has been Shanks, Shanks, Shanks since the get-go, and so I'm thinking that Shanks just killed someone important to him, or something like that at least. Because an interesting caveat with all these different Shanks altercations is that across Kid's 3 attempts, he has not gotten to talk to Shanks a single time. The first time he didn't even get to see Shanks because he got his arm cut off by Ben Beckman first. The second time Kaido kind of got in the way before it even started, and the third time Shanks took him out before he could even say a word. And I think this is really, really important because if Kid did have a chance to talk to Shanks, I think he would find out that it wasn't actually Shanks who did it. Instead, it was his brother, Garland Shamrock. Bruh. So Kid has just had these two mixed up this entire time, which is pretty reasonable because Elbaf kind of has them mixed up as we speak, and it's not like everybody knows about the Gods Knights, right? Especially Kid if he was only like 7 years old or something at the time, because even Loki said that he would have made it further in the world if he ever actually got to fight these guys. And again, going back to what I said earlier, if Rox and Shamrock are going to be this important to Kid's story, then it makes sense why Oda had to wait till now to reveal everything, as he's finally got all the pieces of the chessboard set up. And I think this could also provide a really good opportunity for Luffy and Kid to kind of connect over this. Because obviously if Kid starts off by saying Shanks killed someone important to me, he's a bad guy, etc., Luffy's gonna defend him, just as he did to Loki earlier this arc on several occasions. So if Kid eventually finds out that Shanks does have a twin who's a lot more evil, because Shanks is a pretty chill guy. Even when Kid was about to attack Elbaf, Shanks didn't do anything until he saw that dangerous future, and he even made sure to check if Kid was going to be healed up after the Wano situation. So I think it's going to go a long way to kind of getting Kid and Luffy on the very same page, maybe even to the point where they team up against Shamrock eventually, which would be a pretty crazy parallel to Law and Luffy teaming up against Doflamingo, because in both cases they're facing off against the evil half of a pair of Celestial Dragon brothers, right? But in order for this all to work, there's kind of one key factor that we have to remember, which is that this would have had to have happened before Shanks ever got his scar. Because obviously if the person who killed this person in Kid's backstory did not have a scar, but then Kid went and looked at the bounty posters and did see a scar, then he would already know that they're not the same person. And while we don't know the exact year that that happened, I think the timelines match well enough that this could still potentially work. Because we do know that Shanks got his scar between 19 and 14 years ago, as he didn't have the scar 19 years ago with Uta, but he did 14 years ago in Elbaf when he was visiting Scopper. And while we obviously don't know when this would have happened in Kid's backstory, because we don't even technically know if it happened at all yet, we can maybe guess that this would have happened to Kid around the same age that Shanks met Luffy, which was 7 years old. And with Kid being 23 right now, that would put this at 16 years ago, which does fit pretty well in that time frame. And again, these are just estimates, but I think they're pretty important estimates to make, because at least this whole idea is possible, right? But I think this situation would still leave us with quite a few questions, starting off with, who was this inspiration to Kid exactly? Why did Shamrock go after him? And what does this mean for Kid's future role in the arc, as well as the rest of the story? So let's start by talking about who this guy was exactly. And I think Oda actually gave us somewhat of a hint to this already, because of one of Kid's key character traits, which is that he is an engineer. He likes building things, and this has been true even since he was a child, because we see him holding a wrench here with a robot in the other hand, and I would even say his devil fruit ties into this as well, because he obviously has the magnet fruit. That's a perfect fruit for an engineer, which kind of fits in the theme that we've seen with devil fruits in general, where they always match the person that eats them perfectly. Law was training to be a doctor from a young age, and he got the Opop fruit. Luffy's the most free person we know of, and he got the Nika fruit, and there's probably a ton of other examples that we could think of. So it would stand to reason that Kid's probably connected to some engineering focused person, which is really interesting interesting because there's already some weird connections between Kid and what are probably the two most famous engineers in the story. One being Vegapunk, because Kid does use the word punk in a lot of his attack names, and the other being Franky, because not only are these guys both engineers, but they're also both from the South Blue, and even when they were both kids, they wore the same kind of goggles on their head. But let's start by breaking down the Vegapunk connection, because as I said, Kid uses the word punk in a lot of his attack names, like Punk Rotten, Punk Gibson, Punk Cornadio, even his ship is called the Victoria Punk, and while part of that explanation is obviously that Kid's crew has a punk rock theme, but I do find it kind of uncanny that like the genius of the story, the smartest engineer we know of, is Vegapunk, and even he used the word punk in some of his creations, like Punk Records. And I think this is really important because we obviously know that Franky and Vegapunk have an important connection now, and even those two use kind of the same naming scheme as each other, where Franky calls a lot of his creations BF, whatever number it is, for Battle Franky, so like BF37 for himself now, and Vegapunk calls a lot of his Pacifista PX, whatever number that is, like PX4 here for this random Pacifista. It's the same setup, just different letters. So in a very similar way, I think the way that Kid names a lot of his attacks, or maybe even his creations, is a hint that he and Vegapunk also have a connection. Plus, I found it kind of weird that one of the sea beasts that were outside of Egghead kind of looked like Eustass Kid, and on the side of Kid's railgun, we also see the number 07, and we know that there are 6 Vegapunk satellites, all of whom wear their numbers somewhere on their body, so this has led to a lot of theories about Kid maybe being like the 7th Vegapunk satellite, which I don't think is true in an absolute sense, but if Kid was taught by somebody who learned from Vegapunk and was able to pass down some of that Vegapunk expertise to him, then it might be loosely true, at least in some ways. And as for how Vegapunk and this guy knew each other, I think being in Mads is the easiest answer, and that does work, but I'll get to some other possibilities here in a little bit. But first, I think there's another really important point to make, which again just ties to the Elbaf of it all. But we gotta remember, Vegapunk is an Elbaf, guys, or at least he's gonna be because of the cloning shenanigans, which I know is kind of a hot topic, but even aside from that, we at least have Lilith here, so no matter what, there is Vegapunk representation. So I think that means that Kid and Vegapunk are probably gonna talk about this guy at some point. Kid can get some extra backdrop on this guy from before he knew him, like back when he was in Mads or doing whatever, and then Vegapunk can get updated on what happened to him after that, like when he died protecting Kid. And I think that might lead to some important development, because in Egghead, Atlas lamented over the fact that there weren't enough good engineers in the world, and I think Kid counts as like 1,000 engineers because of his devil fruit. If there's something that Lilith needs built, I think Kid could help her with that. Like, for example, she did say that she intended to build an entirely new lab here so that she could clone Vegapunk. And remember how we found that really old lab up in the Atom Tree? I could definitely see Kid having some kind of role in bringing that thing back to life. And I mean, if Kid comes in and he helps put this lab back together quicker and helps them clone Vegapunk even quicker, that would really kind of make him like the 7th satellite, right? Because the entire point of the satellites was to help Vegapunk get more stuff done by taking some of the tasks away from him. And even here, we have Lilith tasked with that very thing, so if Kid helps her do it, he kinda is the 7th satellite, like not officially, but sorta. And if he does that, I think what might happen in return is that they help Kid improve with his devil fruit. Maybe they help him create a better railgun, which will actually help him defeat Shamrock or whoever later down the line. Because, I mean, the Vegapunks are pretty dang good at making lasers, right? Because they copied Kizaru's lasers in the Pacifista, which are pretty solid. And we even have the Mother Flame, which I'm not sure if Kid's gonna get on that level, but I guess it is technically possible. But now I want to talk about whatever the connection is between Vegapunk and whoever this guy was. Because, like I said, the easiest answer is probably that they were just in Mads together. And I think Franky's backstory actually might provide a hint that that could be true. Or at a bare minimum, that this guy would have a connection to Queen, who we know was in Mads. Because it seems to be the case that Franky is Queen's son. Now, this isn't 100% confirmed, but the Viver cards seem to heavily imply it because their timelines match up almost perfectly. And part of that story is that Franky started his life in the South Blue, meaning that Queen would have also been in the South Blue, the same sea that Kid was born in. But Franky said that this was over 30 years ago in the pre-time skip when he was only 34, so that means that Franky would have come over Reverse Mountain around the time that he was 4 years old. But regardless, that means that Queen would have spent at least 4 years in the South Blue. So you'd have to wonder what Queen was doing bumming around the South Blue all these years, because it's not even like he's from there, he was actually born in the Grand Line, And he was in MADS even before Franky was born. We learned that MADS was established 39 years ago, and we also know that 17-year-old Queen joined around that time. Or back then he was known as CN, or Cyan, like short for scientist. But that means that Queen would have been in MADS and in the South Blue for approximately 7 years. From the start of MADS 39 years ago until 32 years ago when they would have gone over Reverse Mountain. And we also know from the Viver cards that while Queen was in MADS, he was mass producing weapons, which is something he kinda did for Kaido as well with the whole Ice Oni virus and everything. In fact, that's sorta Queen's, Caesar's, and Judge's entire thing is making weapons to finally surpass Vegapunk. So I think that might have been exactly what Queen was doing. Maybe he partnered with whoever Kid's inspiration was to make better weapons, because that guy was better at making them. Queen would have been kinda young back in the day, so he would have needed someone to teach him. Or maybe both of them just joined MADS together at the same time with the same goal, and the reason they stayed in the South Blue is because MADS didn't have their ship yet, the one that we saw during the cover story, which I think is the same ship that Franky rebuilt himself on after the Sea Train thing, but that's a whole separate theory. And I think the island that Queen and Kid's inspiration were working on could just be the very same island that Kid is from, which is called Kutsuku Island. And I quickly want to give a major shout out to another YouTuber named Marco the One Piece Theorist for a lot of this, because he did a video on Franky and Kid over 9 years ago now, and it feels like the evidence for this connection just keeps on building, so major shout out to him. I'll put a link to his video down in the description. But the idea makes a lot of sense, because like I said earlier, it's kinda weird that Franky as a kid looked a lot like Kid as a kid. They both wear these goggles, they both have spiky hair, and while this picture doesn't show Kid with the eyeliner, we know he obviously has that in current day, so that kinda connects as well. And even when Franky first got to Water 7, Tom noted how Franky was already good at building things. And more specifically, he mentioned how Franky was able to build a cannon out of scrap. And building things out of scrap is basically Kid's entire ability. He was even able to make a railgun from random metal from the Onigashima raid. So I really feel like Franky and Kid are just gonna be from the same island, one that was probably just a giant scrap heap or something. So I think instead of saying that Kid's inspiration is like his Shanks, I think a more accurate description is that it's Kid's Tom. Because even if Franky was already talented, Tom obviously taught him a lot about shipbuilding, but more importantly, he taught him the more sentimental stuff, like how you're supposed to love your creations. But I could almost see Kid's Tom saying the opposite, where it doesn't matter what happens to your creations because you can just rebuild them, which again is exemplified by Kid's Devil Fruit. He even had a line to Big Mom once that is just a bunch of scraps, so who cares, because he can just keep remaking it over and over. So I almost see the island that Kid is from is like the Gale-ra of the South Blue, you could say, which is really interesting because we did just hear about a Gale-ra adjacent group called the Gale-ra Warhammer Company. And I don't know what the correct pronunciation is on that, but I'm just going to call it Gale-ra for now. And they were basically a group of giant shipwrights from presumably back in the Void Century. And it seems like they also froze to death somewhere, where many people are assuming that they're the giants from Punk Hazard. And I think there's a really good chance that whoever Kid's Tom is, quote unquote, is a giant from Gale-ra. Because we also saw in chapter 1156 that Rox was looking for the Gale-ra company. And so that got me thinking, well, why is he looking for them? Well, if you're looking for a group of shipwrights, you probably want a ship built, right? And then I also got to thinking, well, he's still under the assumption that he's going to get Harold on the crew eventually, and if you're going to have someone as big as Harold, then you probably need a massive ship. Like, I don't know if it needs to be Noah size, but maybe leaning towards that size. So who better to contract for that than the Gale-ra company? And then that made me think of a couple other really important parallels. You know, going back to Tom, he has two really important plot lines tied to him. The first being the fact that he built the Oro Jackson. And if someone from Gale-ra was responsible for building the ship for the Roger Pirates, maybe somebody from Gale-ra should be responsible for building a ship for the Rox Pirates. So if we're gonna stick with this idea that Kid had a Tom, or maybe kind of like an evil Tom, then it's probably the guy who built the Saber of Xebec. And now technically we don't know if the Saber of Xebec was the Rox Pirate ship, but we know that it's Blackbeard's ship now, so I'm just gonna assume it's his. And if it really was a massive ship that was built to have an ancient giant on it like Harold, maybe that's why we haven't seen it yet, or at least confirmed, because some people think it's one of these log rafts, but I'm not really sure. But if it's a truly massive ship, then he maybe just hasn't used it for practicality reasons, which kind of sucks for San Juan Wolf, because then he wouldn't have to walk on the bottom of the ocean anymore. But regardless, whoever Rox found to build his ship is probably just the guy that inspired Kid. And the other really important plot line that's tied to Tom is the fact that he saw the Pluton blueprints. He has seen how to build an ancient weapon, and not just any ancient weapon, but one that's said to be an ancient giant battleship. And that reminded me of something that I think is really easy for people to skip over, which is that Kid and Killer are kind of also tied to a secret ancient battleship, which is the Ox Lloyd. This is an ancient warship that I think the government had and probably still has, because the Ox Bell was once attached to it, which they still have at Marineford. And this is the bell that Luffy rang to get the government and Paper's attention so that he could do 3D2Y. And while we have never seen this warship and we know almost nothing about it, everything we do know came straight from Killer. Kid and Killer were the ones talking about the Ox Lloyd, and maybe they learned about that from whoever Kid's Tom was. And if you're wondering what the hell the Ox Lloyd is going to end up being, I personally think it could be the Lelucia weapon. I know everyone thinks it's going to be Uranus, but the Ox Lloyd is an ancient warship that the government probably has, so I think that one should be our first guess, honestly. So if Tom's tied to Pluton and Kid's Tom is tied to the Ox Lloyd, we just got parallels all over the place at this point. And if you're wondering at this point, well, aren't the Gale-ra giants frozen? Like, where did Rox find this guy and how did he befriend Kid and all that stuff? Well, I'm not sure if he exactly found the Gale-ra of the past, but I think he might have found a descendant, because, yet again, going down to the South Blue, there is actually an island of giants in the South Blue. And who do we know from there? Jaguar D. Saul. And what's been the recent big plotline surrounding Saul? That he didn't actually freeze to death. He was put into an ice time capsule, but never actually died. And we got that awesome reunion with Robin because of it. So wouldn't it kind of make sense that if Oda's gonna have one giant come back from being frozen, that he would tie to the other giants that we think might come back from being frozen? In fact, if you look at some of the giants that are frozen in ice here, as well as one of the giants from that panel with Jarl and Harold, they actually have the very same teeth as Saul, where they're much more rounded. And that's not something that every giant has. It's kind of unique. So that could also be a hint that all these people are related. And in fact, Saul's not even the only giant that we know of from the South Blue, because we also have Harudin's mother Ida, who was born on Samuwanai Island. And I'm pretty confident that her and Saul are going to be from the same place, because both of them talked about the bad reputation that Elbaf giants have. And honestly, the fact that Saul is also a D-Clan member, meaning that there's D-Clan representation among the giants in the South Blue, makes me think that whoever Kid's Tom was probably also a D-Clan member. I don't know if he'd be Saul's brother, that might be too on the nose, but regardless, we got a lot of stuff brewing here. Because also, Saul and Gale-ra aren't the only giants that we've heard of who were frozen at one point, because we also have Ors, an ancient giant who was frozen to death over 500 years ago. And given the fact that giants can live to be well over 300 years old, that means Ors could have easily been around in the Void Century. So Ors could have been an original Gale-ra member. I mean, his name is literally Ors, right? Like oars for a ship. And if you look at the Gale-la logo, it's a long Viking ship with a bunch of oars. But the thing is, even though Ors died over 500 years ago, he still had a descendant that made it until modern day, which was Little Ors Jr. And so if he wasn't Gale-ra and he had a descendant, what's stopping there being other descendants? Maybe the only reason that there's even giants in the South Blue to begin with is because after the Void Century flood, part of the Gale-ra giants were stuck there and couldn't find their way home, and so they just started doing their own thing. Because Ida even mentioned that while she was born in the South Blue and came over the Red Line, she can't go back. And that's presumably because Reverse Mountain always dumps you right back into paradise. She probably just hasn't found a way to go over the Calm Belt, and what I think that could mean is that even if that island was an island of shipwrights, anybody they sent out to go actually find Elbaf probably never returned. So a lot of them probably thought it was too dangerous or they couldn't find it or whatever, and that's why they stayed on that island this entire time. And here's what really ropes all of this together, is that if we're sticking with these Tom parallels, then this might also explain why Shamrock had to kill this guy, because Tom got persecuted for building the Oro Jackson. The world government does not like it when shipwrights build awesome ships for powerful pirates. And while fishmen are stronger than the average human, I feel like a lot of Cypherpole agencies could have taken care of Tom. But if Kid's Tom was a Gale-ra giant, maybe even being an ancient giant, then that probably would have required the God's Knights to come in. And Tom was originally going to vacate his sentence because he built the sea train, but then the Franky battleship thing happened, so then he got taken to Enies Lobby, where I personally think he's still alive, but we don't really know. But that was a really, really tragic moment for Franky, right? He kind of caused that entire situation. So if Shamrock did come after after Kid's Tom because he built the Saber of Xebec, there's probably going to be a super tragic backstory with Kid, just like there was for Franky. Which then takes us into the final thing that we need to answer, which is what we can expect from Kid during this arc, as well as the rest of the story. And as you could probably expect, I think Kid is gonna try to kill Vegapunk Shamrock. But I know when I say that, there's probably two things that come to mind, and number one is Kid even gonna be strong enough to beat Shamrock, because he just lost to his twin brother Shanks? And the other question is, how is this gonna happen when Shamrock isn't even on Elbaf? And I'll answer the second question first, because yes, Shamrock is not on the island anymore, so he would have to come back, but would that be the most shocking thing at this point? I mean, he has teleportation circles with the Abyss pentagrams, and he only left because of the issues in the Holy Land. So if they get things under control in the Holy Land, or maybe if Emu loses control of Gunko's body so Emu goes back, maybe Shamrock will have to come back to Elbaf to fill that void. Whatever it is, I think there's plenty of opportunity for Shamrock to come back eventually. And then as for whether or not Kid will ever be strong enough to beat Shamrock, I'm not sure if he could right now, but if he undergoes some serious growth during this arc, then I think he definitely could. I mean, look how far Luffy grew in Wano from losing to Kaido in a single blow in Act 1 to defeating him by the end of the Onigashima raid. And yes, he had a lot of help, he had Awakening, he had all that stuff, but if Kid actually recognizes that he needs to grow and that he's not good enough yet, then I think Kid can do it. So I believe that Kid needs basically a complete teardown moment, somewhat like we saw with Zoro after losing to Mihawk, or Luffy before he got sent away by Kuma. He needs to recognize that he's not strong enough, which not only puts himself in danger, but the same goes for his crew. In fact, I think the first thing that Kid needs is a post-Marineford moment, where he realizes that he still has his Nakama, and that's who he needs to be fighting for, because at this point in the story, that's kind of all that Eustass Kid has. He lost his ship, he lost his road poneglyph rubbings, he probably feels like he lost his dream at this point, but he still does have his crew, assuming they all survived, of course. And so just like how Luffy took that lesson and he realized that he needed to get stronger, and so he worked with Rayleigh, Kid basically needs to do the same thing. Whatever power-ups he gets in the future needs to be derived from that feeling of being strong enough to protect his crew. And that honestly connects right into completing his dream as well, because by not being able to protect his Nakama, they were forced to give over the road poneglyph rubbings. And while I personally want to rip into them for just giving them up so easily, I kinda get it because they saw what Shanks did to their captain, so they knew they had no choice. Plus, if Kid was going after the wrong guy this entire time, like we spoke about earlier, then quite literally this entire situation is Eustass Kid's fault. So whether it's strength or decision making or just focusing on the right things, Kid has a lot of improvement to do. So I think next time we see Eustass Kid, he better be just pounding sand on the beach, distraught at what's happened, realizing that he needs to get better, because if so, then I think that will provide some opportunity. Maybe it's the Vegapunk thing like I mentioned earlier, where he can talk to him and improve his railgun and get stronger that way, or maybe someone will come along who can actually teach him hockey, because while we know Kid has all three types of hockey, we have never seen him use it. I've always made the joke that when people are talking about hockey, Kid must think they're talking about ice hockey, because he has never used it a single time in the story. Kaido's apparently seen it, but we never have. And we've even had Kid say things like, wait, hockey can hurt Kaido? So this guy knows next to nothing about it. He's probably just gotten by on his own hubris, his devil fruit, and just being more violent than everyone else. And if he were to learn how to weaponize Conqueror's hockey better, which we know is tied to defeating the God's Knight's regeneration in some way, shape, or form, then that would set him up pretty well to go against Vegapunk Shamrock. And like I said earlier, I think it might make more sense if him and Luffy teamed up against Shamrock, because it fulfills the Law and Luffy vs. Doflamingo parallel, but also because this could be a chance for both of them to grow. In fact, if you go back to the Udon prison situation, the one thing that Luffy and Kid did kind of bond over was their love for their Nakama, because Luffy saw Kid's reaction to learning that Killer ate a smile fruit. Kid literally escaped the prison and stopped trying because he was so distraught over that situation, and you could see Luffy be impacted by that. I mean, the simple fact that Luffy remembered who Killer was kind of shows that he was invested in this, because Luffy barely remembers who anyone is. He only remembered Marco because Robin brought up the pineapple thing. So I think this is a little bit of foreshadowing that the next thing Kid and Luffy are going to connect over is still their Nakama. In fact, if Kid is going to have a post-Marineford moment, what if Luffy almost acts as the Jinbei, where he's the one who grabs Kid and reminds him of what he still has? And I feel like a deep emotional scene like this is something Kid really needs to get the fandom back on his side, especially because he's more of a crass or angry type of character, so we don't expect the sentimental stuff. But based off what we saw in Udon, we know that side of him exists, and if Luffy's the one to bring that out and drive Kid to improve, that would help everyone to like Kid a whole lot more. And as for exactly what power-up Kid would get to use against Shamrock, you know, we talked a little bit about the railgun, we talked a little bit about him getting Conqueror's Haki, but I actually think the best thing is for him to combine both, because not only would that improve his railgun, but it might also let him hurt the Gods Knights. And I think the funniest ending for all of this would be if Kid used that railgun to blow off Shamrock's arm, so that he looks just like him and Kid, and all the red-haired people are missing the same arm. Maybe Shamrock will even try to tank the attack, thinking that Kid isn't strong enough to do that, and just like how Summers was surprised that his hand didn't grow back, Shamrock might be freaking out that his arm's not growing back. And I think this is a little better than them just killing Shamrock, so that way Shamrock could be relevant later in the story. Which brings us to the other point, which is what's Kid gonna do in the future? Because the thing about Kid is the only dream we really know that he has is to go get the One Piece, which everyone wants to do that. But if you look at Luffy, he has a secret second dream, and even Law has shifted his focus to finding out the will of D now. So I think Kid needs to find his own lane, and if you guys have any ideas for this, let me know down below, because the only thing I can really think of right now is that he will just want to take down all the Gods Knights. If they were the main source for most of Kid's suffering throughout his life, he might just want to take them all down in one fell swoop, which could mean destroying the Red Line. That would literally bring down Marijois, and it would also be a massive feat that I think he could realistically do. Because if he improves his railgun, maybe almost to a Mother Flame level, then I think that would be perfect. But even better than that, we heard from Dory and Brogy that the one thing they can't break is the serpent soaked in blood, which we know is the Red Line. And they told us that while doing Hakoku Sovereignty at the end of Little Garden, which is the very same attack that Dory and Brogy used to break Kid's ship. So if he's able to improve his railgun to the point that it's stronger than Hakoku Sovereignty, meaning simultaneously that Kid would be strong enough to defend his ship and his crew from massive attacks, but also that he's strong enough to destroy the Red Line. I feel like everyone kind of believes that the Red Line is going to get broken eventually, and the most common theory is probably just that Luffy's going to do it, but if this is something that Kid actually does, that would be a pretty cool lane for him, I think. So all things considered, I think Kid is actually set up to have a massive arc here in Elbaf. And then for this final section of the video, I did have one more Kid theory that connects him to Rock's D Xebec, and I wanted to put it in earlier, but it felt like it kind of messed with the flow, and it sort of teases another video that I want to do soon about how Rox found out the true history, so I thought it made sense to just kind of throw this in the end, as it still is very, very interesting. Because I think we have some evidence that Kid and Rox were the first two people from their respective generations to make it to the final island on the Grand Line, which is Lodestar Island, where most pirates learn about the existence of the road poneglyphs. So how do we know this for Rox? Well, this was something Roger hinted at during God Valley, when he said, "Do you have any idea how I felt this past year?" And 1 year before that was when Roger visited Lodestar. This seems to hint at some conflict between the two there, which I talked about in more depth in my Lodestar video, which is still a good watch as long as you skip the Scopper Gabon section, but it shouldn't really be a surprise that Rox would beat everyone to Lodestar, since he was sailing at least 17 years before Roger made it there, and he even made it to the Flower Room, so I don't think anywhere is really off limits for him. This guy's kinda like the One Piece Chuck Norris at this point. And then how do we know that Kid already made it there? Well, how else would he know that the road poneglyphs even exist without going there first? We know he went to Whole Cake in the time skip targeting their road poneglyph rubbing, so even before that point he figured it out. And you gotta remember, he didn't have the same luxury as Law or Luffy, who had Inuyasha explain it to them, nor did he have the same luxury of Shanks, Blackbeard, or Buggy, who were all on top tier pirate crews that already knew about this stuff. I mean, all three of those guys were there when Roger asked for Odin. So Kid figured it out on his own somehow. So unless he got that information from like a Roger pirate or someone on that level, which maybe his inspiration would have been, but Kid would have only been like 7 years old, so I don't think he's really asking these big questions. islands, I think he just did it the old-fashioned way and went to Lodestar Island. But then you'd probably have to ask how he got there so quickly, and also how he backtracked a whole cake or wherever else so easily, since the log poses usually send you in one direction. Well, I think that's all due to the fact that Kid might not even need a log pose, since he might be one himself, thanks to his magnet fruit, the Jiki Jiki no Mi. I think he's just able to sense the island's magnetic poles and direct his ship there, which is why I always pick Kid for my navigator on any One Piece crew fantasy draft. And to be completely fair, we did see Kid with a log pose at the end of Wano, so we know he has one, but I don't think that means he needs it, because what those three were trying to do is just make sure they don't go to the same island. And right before that scene, they talked about how they don't have any leads for the man marked by flames. So without any lead on the guy, and that being their next target, they don't really have anywhere else to go, so why not follow the log pose? Kid even said when they were pulling up on Elbaf, "When have I ever skipped adventuring an island?" So I think he could have gone to a more specific place if he knew where he needed to go, but since he didn't, he just followed the log poses anyway, as that would also make sure he doesn't run back into Law and Luffy. And this would also let Kid skip the time requirement of needing to stay on an island while the log pose calibrates, which can even take up to a year, as we saw in Little Garden. And Oda even reminded us of this phenomenon in Egghead, because ours didn't update yet after being there for a day, and that's what even allowed us to go to Elbaf in the first place, since we were still locked onto the same 3 islands from after Wano. And since Kid could go backwards or forwards or wherever he wanted, and he never needed to stop on an island for the calibration stuff, he would have no problem finding his way around the new world as fast as he wanted. And I think this alone could honestly do a lot for Kid's character, just because he would kind of have something to hold over the rest of their heads, right? Like there's actually something that he would have beat them at. It's almost like the post-time skip version of having the highest bounty, because at the end of the day, it doesn't really mean anything, like getting the One Piece is the ultimate goal, but if he at least completed the Grand Line first, that is something that he can brag about. And I could even see this being something that Kid didn't get access to until he awakened, which could maybe provide a cool flashback eventually. But either way, that is it for this video today, so thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed it, please hit like and subscribe down below. And there was even a little bit more that I wanted to add to this video, but honestly, I gotta hurry up and get started on the next one, because man, Oda's given us way too much to work with right now. So if anything stood out to you, or if you have anything to add, please let me know down below. But until next time, later.